Hello, and welcome to our 7th lesson in the series that we're doing on the first half of the Old Testament. I'm Kerry Muhlestein, I'm your instructor, and today we're going to talk about Joshua and the era of the Judges. Now let's be clear that actually we could do a full lesson on either one of these or more than a full lesson on either one. We're trying to fit a lot of material into a short amount of time when we're doing these classes. We're doing half of the Old Testament in one series, so we're going to move pretty quickly, and yet I hope that we still give you a good overall picture and some of the power that comes from these stories and these scriptures can come to you. So let's jump in and see what we can do. We're going to review where we've been so far by reviewing where Israel has been so far and see if we can get us where we want to be. So let's review. We don't know for sure where the Israelites are coming from, but most people think it's this area here. And they go, some people think actually through some of this water area here. I actually think it is the Red Sea, but we don't know for sure their route. But they come somewhere along this. Most likely they come down here. We don't know for sure the Exodus route. I've written an article on this. I think that this is our most likely route, but we don't really know, and that this is our most likely candidate for Mount Sinai. In any case, we do know that they worked their way up to Kadesh Barnea, and we know about where that is. And you'll remember that that's where they send in the spies, and they listen to the less faithful spies, the 10 less faithful spies, rather than Caleb and Joshua, who are full of faith. And as a result, they decide that they will not go into the promised land. They actually then, when they learn they're going to have to wait for a generation to go in, they try to go into the promised land. They say, okay, never mind, we'll go in, and God doesn't help them, and it doesn't work out well. So now they will wander. And we talked a little bit about the wandering, but not very much in our last lesson. So I wanted to give you just a few details. From Kadesh Barnea they go, and we don't know the exact route, but somehow they get over across where the east side of where the Jordan River would be, in the area. They don't go through Edom or Moab, because the Edomites and the Moabites say you can't go through, and God says we don't want you to go to war against these guys because they're actually related to you. So they have to go around or through or something, but they have to find ways to not interact with those guys. It's not true of a couple of people such as Sihon and Og, that they want to fight the Israelites, and the Lord helps them fight these people. So they go up and down this area, and this is where they spend most of their 40 years, is over on this side. Most of the time they'll camp in a place for a year or several years and then move. So it's not like every day they're packing up and moving. But they don't really have a permanent home, and they go back and forth. But they come to where they know this area well. They control the area for the most part, and some of the tribes actually decide, hey, we really like it over here, we'd like to stay here. Moses says, okay, that makes me nervous. I'm not so sure I want to give you an inheritance over here because we need you to come and help us conquer the people of the land of Canaan. So we'll give you an inheritance on this side of the River Jordan if you will make an oath that you will come and help us fight on the other side, and that's what happens. The final time with Moses will be on Mount Nebo, which is right here. And that's where they will look. Moses will look over into the promised land, but he won't go. He'll give his valedictory address, which is the book of Deuteronomy, and renew the covenant with them, as we spoke about last time, and then they will go across the Jordan River and to Jericho and so on, and we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. These are the areas where you'll find that you have Reuben and Gad get their inheritance, and half of Manasseh. Manasseh will get an inheritance on the other side as well, but Manasseh controls a large area here. And so this is where some of the tribes will have their tribal allotment, as we said. Then the Israelites come and camp in what are known as the plains of Moab. And as we said, Moses will be up here on Mount Nebo. We also have the famous story of Balaam, who the Moabites want to prophesy against the Israelites, and he says he'll only do what God wants him to. And he goes up to give a prophecy, and his donkey tries to stop him, and his donkey talks, and then an angel protects the donkey, and so on. Anyway, it's a great story. He gives 3 separate prophecies in which he prophesies that the Israelites will actually have a Messiah, and that they will be strong and conquer their enemies, and so on. Not exactly what the Moabites wanted to hear. But in any case, the Israelites are here, and it's from here that they will go across the River Jordan. This is when Joshua finds himself about to leave Moses behind. Now, in the Old Testament, the way we have it, Moses dies there on Mount Nebo. We know he's actually translated on Mount Nebo so that he can come to the Mount of Transfiguration later with Elijah and Peter, James, and John and the Savior. But we know that he'll be translated. But either way, Joshua is going to have to now take charge of this group and fill Moses' shoes, and those are some big shoes, really big shoes. You think about it. This generation has known nothing but miracle-working Moses. That's the only leadership they've known, and so this is tough. These are tough shoes to fill. So notice, turn with me to Joshua chapter 1, and notice what the Lord says to Joshua. We're not going to read everything in here, but we're going to read a couple of things. So we get verse 1 and 2. Now, after the death of Moses, now we know it's not his death, but his translation, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead, or translated as we would take it. Now therefore arise and go over Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. And every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. Now let's jump down to the verse 5. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. This is the promise. That and Israel needs to know this, that God will be with Joshua every bit as much as he was with Moses. Now, he says, I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Then verse 6, be strong and of a good courage. For unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land, which I swear unto their fathers to give them. Only be thou strong and very courageous. Let's skip down to verse 9. Have I not commanded thee, be strong and of a good courage? Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. Now let's skip to the end of the chapter. The last verse, which is verse 18, reads, whosoever he be that doth rebel against thy commandment, and will not hearken unto thy words, and all that thou commandest him, he shall be put to death. Only be strong and of a good courage. You probably noticed a theme in all of that, and I think this is something the Lord would say to all of us. I would guess that Joshua was approaching this with some trepidation, knowing it's a big job he has to do to conquer the land of Canaan, and that he needs to get his people to follow him when he is not Moses. And so the Lord tells him, I will be with you, be strong and courageous. I think the Lord says that to all of us when he asks us to do something that seems to be beyond our ability. And let's be clear, he'll ask us to do all sorts of things that are beyond our ability. But the Lord tells him that he will make him equal to the task. That's the I will be with you, if he will just be strong and courageous. I think the Lord is saying that to all of us. Now let's pause for just a moment and discuss a rather sensitive issue. And that is that the Israelites are being asked to go into the land of Canaan and destroy the Canaanites, to completely wipe them out. That's rather drastic, I would say. And we're often uncomfortable with that, and I actually am happy that we're uncomfortable with it. That should cause us some pause, because life is precious. And so we have to kind of put ourselves in God's shoes again. And let's go back and learn some of the lessons that we learned when we talked about the flood and Noah. Remember, first of all, that while we are not authorized to take life, God is the one who gives and takes life, so he can be in charge of that. He's not going to tell you to do anything along those lines, so just ignore that idea. But he is the one that tells us, or he is the one who gives life and takes life away. Let's also remember that from God's perspective, that this life is a short time, and what he really wants is to give people the opportunity to change. What we learn from elsewhere in Scripture is that the people in the land of Canaan had been given lots of opportunity to change. We see that he tells Abraham, when he first promises him the land, that he will have to have his descendants go into a strange land and be there for hundreds of years, because the people in Canaan weren't ripe for iniquity. We learn from Nephi in 1 Nephi 17 that the people of Canaan had prophets that were preaching to them for hundreds of years, like Noah preached to the people in his day for 120 years, telling them they need to change and repent or they'll be destroyed, and they don't listen. They reject the word of God. Then remember what we said about the flood, that part of the issue is that you have to remove this amazingly high degree of wickedness so that you can have people that will have a chance to start in righteousness and actually be righteous and thrive. That's exactly what's going on in the land of Canaan, and God is clear. If you leave some of them, which they do, they will influence you so that you won't keep the covenant, which is exactly what happens. But the idea is that we're going to remove them so that they don't. And let's also keep in mind what we said when we talked about the flood, that when we remove them, again, death is such a big deal to us, but from God's perspective, it's saying, I'm going to take you from this room to this room and give you some time, and then I work with you again, and you have another chance. We don't get it mentioning that specifically for the Canaanites, but since it mentions that for the people in the days of the flood, and we're also told they're the most wicked people ever, I think it's a natural and logical assumption that this second chance also happens for the Canaanites. That all those who are moved from one world, or from one room, which is the world of mortality, to another room, which is the sphere of post-mortality, or the spirit world, or whatever you'd like to call that, that's just the place where they have some time to learn and to change, and then again have a chance to accept the gospel and come to God through Christ. That's what's happening for these people, and that kind of perspective can help us with this. In any case, now the Israelites are going to go through, and they're going to need to cross the Jordan River. Now, this is tricky, because this is the time of year when the Jordan River is flooding. All right, and so this picture, this is modern, obviously, so you can see the modern constructions there, but hopefully it helps you picture, and the Jordan doesn't flood now like it did then because we irrigated all along the way and so on. But still, you can get the idea of the Jordan flooding and it getting to be hard to cross. And this is the story that we've already shared just a little bit, the idea that they will follow the ark in faith, and that covenant and atonement is what will lead them into the promised land, right? And so we talked about that in the last lesson, and so they are able to go across the Jordan River. God tells them that, and what happens is he parts it. Now, there are several important things here. One, that makes it so they can go across. There's a nice logistical element to this. Two, if you were going to talk about something like a signature miracle, Moses' signature miracle is parting the Red Sea. So for Joshua to have the Jordan River part is a clear sign that God is with him the way he was with Moses. That's really important. When we get to the second half of the Old Testament, we'll see the same thing happening with Elijah and Elisha. But God also asked them to take stones from the river, one for each tribe, so 12 stones, and make a memorial on the other side, as a remembrance that God was with them as he miraculously brought them into the land that they were to inherit. There's really something about this, something that helps us remember. Now, we don't want it to be something that will become something we worship. We don't want it to become idolatry. But we should have something that helps us remember the miracles that God has worked in our lives and that God has fulfilled his promises with us. Some way of memorializing those events in our lives is important. A journal might be something. President Eyring has suggested we keep a journal and record the things that God has done for us in a journal. There are other things you can do to kind of commemorate important events where you've seen miracles in your life. There are all sorts of things. Whatever it is, I think this is a lesson that we can all learn. Now, as they're coming across the Jordan River and they're ready to go to Jericho, let's pause and ask an important question. You remember back at Kadesh Barnea when the 10 spies were afraid to go into the promised land and all of Israel decided to follow their fearful advice. What were they afraid of? The two things were they said that the people were really, really big, too strong for them to fight, and that the walls that they could hide behind were too big. They could never conquer their cities because the walls were so big. So let's look at how God handles those things. To some degree, we're going to talk about like numbers of people as big instead of big guys. We'll see the big guys when we get to the David and Goliath story. But numbers of people and big walls are what we're going to look at here. And of course, you're already thinking, well, I know how that happens with the Jericho story. That's going to happen with lots of ways. But let's keep in mind how they overcome those two things that they were afraid of, and we will see that when God is on their side, just like when God is on our side, then even though those are realistic obstacles, they can be over and will be overcome with God's help. So they come to the city of Jericho, the Old Testament city of Jericho. You can see here the The dirt there, that's where the Old Testament city was. In Old Testament times, typically cities were built on hills, and then as they lived there for thousands of years, the hills got bigger and bigger because they just kept building on top of their old houses and so on. But they did, and they'd have walls around them. They did that because that helped protect them, all right? So you've got the New Testament era Jericho out here, but this is Old Testament era Jericho right there. So the Israelites are going to go across the River Jordan, and they're going to make a place that they call Gilgal. It will be their camp. We don't know exactly where it is. There aren't archaeological remains from this temporary camp that was like for a generation, but still somewhat temporary. And Gilgal literally means like to circle up. And so it's probably a place where they circled the rat wagons kind of a thing, right? But they circle up, and it's somewhat near Jericho, and from there they will go to Jericho. And we're not going to go into detail in the story. We're not going to really handle it in depth. What we will say is, that Rahab helps the spies come in, and then she lets them back out. And then Joshua comes to the Lord. He sees the Lord. It's called the captain of the host, but this seems to be the Lord himself that he sees. And the advice that he's given, that he's supposed to walk around this wall with the host of Israel once a day for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, he'll go around 7 times. They go in silence the first 6 days, and then the seventh day, they blow their horns, or these shofars, these ram's horns, and then that will take care of the problem for them. Now, I want you to put yourself in the place of the Israelites. Does that plan make any sense? And the answer is no, it makes no sense at all. If you're just going to look at this from worldly eyes and from the things that we know and understand, how will walking around the walls make them come tumbling down? And the answer is they won't, unless God is on your side. And this is an important lesson. Often God will ask us to do things that don't seem to make sense, at least from a worldly perspective or from the world's advice or anything we can see with our normal eyes. They won't make sense. And we shouldn't worry about that because they don't need to make sense. I would actually be kind of disappointed if the things of God did make sense. I hope that he sees things in a way that go beyond the way I can see them. And so it's wonderful that God can tell us to do things that go beyond what makes sense to us, and then hopefully we will trust him and act on them, and then we'll see that with God those things make sense. That's exactly what happens here. Now, archaeologically, there's some interesting things. Jericho's a very, very old place. In fact, there's a tower there that most scholars date as the oldest building still that we can find trace of in the world. It's very, very old. People have lived in Jericho for a long time. It's below sea level, about 700 feet below sea level. So it's warm. There's a spring there, so that it's often called the city of palm trees in the Old Testament. They have the water and the warmth that they can grow and a lot of agriculture. So it's a great place, and people had lived there for a long time. So if we want to look archaeologically for a wall from this time period, we actually don't find one. But what we find is a wall that was built hundreds of years earlier. The good news is that we actually can find lots of other places in Canaan where we know people were using those walls that were built around this same time period, what we'd call the Middle Bronze period, instead of the Late Bronze period, which is when we have Joshua coming in. There are lots of Middle Bronze walls that are still in use in the Late Bronze Age. They were built well enough, and why rebuild the wall when it's working and so on? And there was a Middle Bronze Age wall there. And somewhat recent excavations have found remains of the bricks in the wall. So what they actually did is they built walls on top of what we call a glacis. So they'd get kind of a sloped bunch of rocks, just a whole bunch of rocks that would be taller. They'd make a pile all the way around the city, taller than a man. And then on top of that, they build a brick wall. And you can't get up to the brick wall with your siege engines or anything like that, because you've got this pile of rocks down below. And so it's an effective way of defending a city. So here you can see some of the remains. You can see the bricks there, right, that they've found. It was an Italian excavation that found these things. You can see along here these layers of bricks. Now, interestingly, down on one of the sides, you can see an area And this is a little bit hard to see now because the water's gotten on it, but there are bricks there. In fact, I've been there more recently than when I took these pictures, and you can't really see the bricks anymore at all. Here's the glacis that I was talking about. You see this pile of rocks? That's still there. And on the other side of the pile of rocks, you get these piles of bricks that have fallen down. Can you, right there, so here's the glacis. Can you see as they started to excavate, can you see the bricks? They're all at an angle. They seem to have fallen down, and you can see individual bricks there. You can't see them anymore if you were to go there today, but you can see them then. Again, you can see bricks here, a couple bricks here, or you can see the evidence of bricks there. They've fallen off of this glacis. So it would seem that what's happened, and I want you to think of how perfectly this works. You've got the glacis, right? So picture this hand as the glacis, or this pile of rocks, and you've got a wall on top of it. And then when they march around 7 times and they blow their horns, I don't know if it's the whole wall or just a portion of the wall, but let's say at least somewhere, right here where my hands are, the wall falls down like this, and it actually builds a handy little ramp that you can run up on top of the glacis and go in. I don't know if that's exactly how it happens, but looking at these remains, I think that is what happened. Not everyone agrees that that's what happened here. There are people who would posit that this wall is from earlier, and so they would say it's too early and this can't be up. But I don't think that argument holds up very well, because we know that, as I said, that people were using those walls for hundreds of years. And so it looks to me like that's evidence for it. Whether there's evidence for it or not, we know it happened because it's written about in the Bible, right? And so one of the questions I want to ask is, what should we learn from Jericho? And I think at least one of the answers is that when you trust in God, unbelievable things become believable and happen, and He will overcome your obstacles. This is one of the stories of how they overcame walls that were too big for them to get over to conquer the people in the land of Canaan. And it was because they did what God asked them to, even when they couldn't see how it was going to work. They believed, and God made it happen. That's a wonderful and important thing. Now, once they get into the Promised Land, Joshua does something that Moses had asked him to do. He gets a group of people on Mount Ebal and another group on Mount Gerizim. And one of the groups, and so like half the tribes on one and half the tribes on the other, so it's everyone. One of the groups calls out the blessings that happen to you when you keep the covenant, and the other group calls out the cursings or the reversals that happen when you don't keep the covenant. We talked about those when we talked about the covenant, how for every blessing, there's a reversal of that blessing. There's not a neutral ground you stay in, right? And so in order to, as they renew the covenant, in order to remind people of that, they have this opportunity where they shout forth blessings, and then they also remind you of the cursings that happen. There's another couple little stories of them they go against a place called Ai, but someone had kept something from Jericho they weren't supposed to, so God doesn't help them, and they have to find out who did that, and God helps them find out, and then He helps them because they go against Ai, and they're able to conquer them. The next big story, and this is a big part of their conquering the land of Canaan. At the end of all of this, we're going to talk about what it means and what state it's in when they've conquered the land of Canaan, and that's from the story of the Gibeonites. All right, so I'm going to show you in just a minute on a map where Gibeon is, but here's a picture of it. Gibeon, well, let's just show you this. So Jericho and Gilgal are down here, about 700 feet below sea level. Then you go up some mountains and come to Gibeon just at the tops of the mountains and back down. So this peak is about 2,600, 2,800 feet above sea level. Gibeon's just a little lower than that. But you can see you've got like well over 3,000 feet of elevation gain to get from here to Gibeon. So that will come into play in a minute. But the people from Gibeon, the problem is for the Canaanites is that they've heard about the Israelites. They've heard what happened to the Egyptians, and they're afraid of the Israelites because of what happened to the Egyptians. Then the Israelites, every time they've had a battle as they've left, after leaving Egypt and as they've been going through that Trans-Jordan or east side of Jordan area, they've been defeating people again and again and again there. So all the Canaanites are terrified of the Israelites. And so the Gibeonites come up with a plan. They decide they would like to ally themselves with the Israelites. The problem is God has told Joshua, you should not ally yourself with anyone in Canaan because you're supposed to get rid of everyone in Canaan so they won't be an evil influence on you and turn you to idolatry. There's a lot of lessons from that as well, but in any case, they're not supposed to make alliances there. And so Joshua is determined to keep that. But the Gibeonites come up with a tricky plan. So they send a big group from Gibeon down to Gilgal. And this group has found their oldest clothes and gotten them really dusty. And they found old and moldy food and brought it with them. And they show up at Gilgal and they say, we have been traveling from a long, long ways away. We've been traveling for a long time. We're coming into this land. You're coming into this land. Maybe we can be allies. And Joshua says, that's a great idea. Thinking that he's safe, these aren't Canaanites. They're from somewhere else. So he makes an alliance with them. And then God says, you should have asked me first. That's a good lesson as well. In any case, he says, you should have asked me first. These people are like the next town you're supposed to go against. And now you've made an alliance with them. So Joshua will honor the alliance, but he does say, okay, you are going to serve the tabernacle. You're going to, because you deceived us, you're going to bring the water for the tabernacle, cut the wood for all the fires that we have there and that kind of a thing. But so he has made an alliance with them, but they're going to have to pay a bit of a price for having deceived him. Well, all of the other Canaanites find out that the Gibeonites have become allies with Israel. They're afraid to go against Israel, but they're not afraid to go against Gibeon. So all the Canaanite cities around there, and this is really an era of city-states. Lots of different cities around that are kind of small city-states. But they all decide, let's us ally together to go and destroy Gibeon so that we can get rid of them, and it makes Israel so they're not even stronger than they were. And that's exactly what happens, is they all come, they march, and they're hoping that they arrive quickly, and they're hoping that they can get there and destroy them before the Israelites here and can respond. So one day, the camp of this huge group of Canaanites shows up in front of Gibeon, and they're planning on the next morning destroying them. Well, the Gibeonites get someone out, and they run all the way down this hill to Gilgal, and they let Joshua know. And Joshua says, I will honor the treaty, I'll honor the alliance, I will come and help you. And so he has the Israelites do an all-night march. So that when the morning comes, and you have, so this side is where the Israelites are coming from. You go over this hill and way down, way down. This side is where the Canaanite army would have been. And as they wake up in the morning ready to go to battle against the Gibeonites, the Israelites are arriving on the scene. And this doesn't work well for the Gibeonites. Here's a picture of that same area on one of the rare times it snowed, so I thought that was worthwhile. But again, here's this big plain. And so the Israelites immediately start to go to war against all of the Canaanites there. And this is a combined Canaanite army like all of the Canaanites in the southern part of Canaan. We should talk about the phrase Canaanite. It doesn't really mean that much. It's just a phrase that's used to describe anyone in this area. They're not necessarily a homogeneous society, homogeneous culture. We don't know anything about speaking. They don't seem to have writing. If they do, we can't find record of it. There's some shared elements and some different elements. It's kind of a nebulous term, this idea of Canaanites. In any case, they are all gathered there from the southern part. And God sends hailstones down upon them to destroy them. So I want you to stop and think, if they have a huge number of them, that doesn't matter. So this is part of what they're afraid of. They're big guys, and I think some of that means that there are a huge number of them. That doesn't matter. God will help the Israelites with that problem too. He sends hailstones down to kill them. The Israelites are afraid that they can't get behind their walls. Well, look at this. Now they've caught all of those Canaanites not behind their walls. Right? And so the Israelites start to fight them, and the hailstones come, and they chase them. We said, okay, we already showed that map. So they chase them from here and along the Beit Horon Ridge, it says. So that's this ridge right here. So Gibeon would just be off to this side here, and they chase them all along there. Now the promise, and then down, and they're all trying to run away now. The Canaanites are trying to run away and get to their cities before the Israelites can kill them all. And what Joshua wants to do is kill them before they get behind their walls. They finally have them outside of their walls. The problem is that this battle goes on all day, and it's starting to get to be night. And in the night, these Canaanites will be able to slip away. The Israelites won't be able to follow them so well or head them off, and they'll be able to slip away and get to their various cities and hide behind their walls. So what happens? Well, let's read it. This is in Joshua chapter 10. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ailon. So the Beit Horon Ridge falls down into what's called the valley of Ailon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hastened not to go down about a whole day. It's an incredible story. Not wanting them to get away in the dark, God helps them with that problem as well. Can you see all the miracles in here? I understand why those Israelite spies were afraid, but that was because they didn't believe that God could do it. And it's very, very clear God could do it. So now you just have to stop and think how that works in your life, because there are certainly things in your life that seem insurmountable, but not with God. God can do it. So here's a little map where you can see there's Gilgal, and they come up to Gibeon, and then they chase these guys all along here fighting them, and eventually into all sorts of little towns all over the place. And they destroy them before they can get into those towns. And so now this is called the Southern Campaign. The whole southern half of Canaan has been defeated in this one big battle because they foolishly came out from behind their city walls. But this is what God did to make this all work out, and the walls were not an obstacle for God. It's a great story, isn't it? Just amazing what God does when we will allow him to in our lives. So you still have the northern half. And there is one city that's bigger than all the other cities up there, and they have a king who is then more powerful than all of the other kings up there. And they've heard what's gone on with the Israelites, and I don't know why they didn't quite learn from the mistakes of the people down in the south and say, okay, let's not all gather in one place. But they decided they would gather to this big, big city that's called Hatzor, all right? And so you can see it on a map. It's way up north of the Sea of Galilee. So the other things all happen down here in the south. But up north in the Sea of Galilee, all the Canaanites from all around came to gather in Hatzor. Now, it makes some sense. Hatzor was a huge city, so big that actually besides their walls, they built up what's called a berm. They built up just kind of a natural wall. They just put dirt all around, and you can see it. That was in the summer. This is in the spring. This goes around a huge, many acres. I should know how many acres, but I can't think of it. This berm that goes, that's not the berm there. This is the berm. So they can actually get all these armies from all of these cities inside this berm, which is like inside walls. So they're not fully inside a wall, but they're a little bit more protected. But they have made the mistake of getting everyone in one place instead of all these people behind walls that they can't get through. And so God says to Joshua, go against these armies in Hatzor. And it is easier to get over these berms than it is over walls, and that's what they're able to do. And they destroy this entire army with God's help. We've actually found, so this is the city up here, but down here is the lower city. And there's excavation has been done since I took this picture. I've been there talking to the excavators while they've been excavating from times, especially just right here. They've actually found temples where you can see that around the time of Joshua, the temples were destroyed. The statues that were statues of gods were knocked over and destroyed and so on. Pretty clear evidence that Joshua and the gang were here. Again, you can kind of see where some of that excavation was happening right in this area. And then inside, you come up here and you go around here, and there's this, they've covered it so that the remains won't be ruined, but there was this huge palace. And in the palace, they imported a lot of stone and so on. But I want you to see this stone and these bricks. This stone is actually cracked from the fire that was in there. Interestingly, the book of Joshua tells us that Hatzor is the only city that he burned with fire. And there was a huge ash level found there. And when you do a chemical analysis on this, it looks like that fire got to be over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe even up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's why it's cracking stone and all sorts of other things. There's clear evidence that someone from around the time period of Joshua came in and destroyed that city and burned it. And of course, we know it's Joshua. And so God helps them overcome these big people and these big walls in the north as well, so that that by now they've conquered all of the armies everywhere. So now we have to ask ourselves, what's the state of Canaan after the conquest? And it would be tempting to think, well, everyone was defeated, so the Israelites can just take over everything. Well, they've been defeated, but we've learned even in recent time, if you think of the war in Iraq and so on, that there's a difference between defeating armies and occupying a territory. And that's where the Israelites find themselves right at this point in time as we get towards the end of Joshua's life. They have defeated all of these armies, but they haven't gotten into every city, and they haven't occupied it. So there are still Canaanites in these cities. So let's just use as an example Jerusalem. The Jebusites, who are the people who live in Jerusalem, were part of the group that was defeated at Gibeon. And Jerusalem was kind of defeated. The army that belonged to Jerusalem was defeated, but the Israelites didn't get inside of Jerusalem. So we'll find that hundreds of years later, when David comes, there's still Canaanites, specifically the group called the Jebusites, that are living inside that city. They conquered their army, but they weren't able to occupy it. It's a long, long process for the Israelites to start to actually control Canaan enough where they can live in all the different parts of Canaan. It just happens gradually over time. But they do divide up the land in this way so that each group gets their own tribal inheritance. And we could talk about this in all sorts of ways, but I don't know that it's particularly necessary. There are just a couple things that I think are going to be worth pointing out. Notice that Simeon is in the middle of Judah. And Simeon is not strong enough to really hold that territory on their own, so they turn to Judah for help, and Simeon ends up just being absorbed in Judah. So when we talk about the division of the kingdoms later with Benjamin and Judah in there, you should know that Simeon's actually just kind of by default included in there. Simeonites have become Judahites. But there are still 10 tribes in the north because you actually kind of have 13 tribes when you have Ephraim and Manasseh. So you do have 2 tribes in the south and 10 in the north, but that's just having Simeon not be anyone. But the other issue is that Levi lives in both areas. The Levites live all over the place. Also, the tribe of Dan is in this area. When we get to the story of Samson, it's in the tribe of Dan. He's from the tribe of Dan. Dan also has a hard time conquering and holding their area, so eventually most of them will migrate all the way to the north and settle in this area that will be called Tel Dan, or the city of Dan. They'll end up, this is where most of Dan will end up instead of here. So that's also part of why when we draw the line going along like this, we've got 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south, because Dan is mostly in the north. But in any case, you have the tribes being divided up this way. And then as Joshua is done and is about to die, he will do a covenant renewal again in chapter 23. And so let's turn to Joshua chapter 23. He will lead them one more time in a covenant renewal process. This is something that it would seem was supposed to happen every generation. It turns out it seems like they don't do it all the time, and that's to their detriment. But notice some of the things that Joshua says as he visits with the people. He tells them in verse 5, "And the Lord your God, he shall expel them, the Canaanites, from before you, and drive them from out of your sight." So they're not all the way gone yet, right? And in the end, they never will be. "And ye shall possess their land, as the Lord your God hath promised unto you." Now look at verse 6. "Be ye therefore very courageous." Have you heard that before? This is Joshua passing on the advice that was given to him. "To keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that ye turn not aside therefrom to the right hand or to the left." Right, and so he's going to encourage them to keep the covenants, to keep the commandments, because that's their major obligation under the covenant, so that they can receive all of the blessings, including the blessings or promise of the promised land. Let's go to the very last verse of that chapter, verse 16. "And when you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods," so Joshua knows they're going to, "and have bowed yourselves to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given unto you." So he gives them that warning, but then he's going he calls them all together in chapter 24 to Shechem, and he's going to exhort them to not, he knows it will happen, but he wants to exhort them for it not to happen, and also that they can come back. So in chapter 24, we have these famous verses that are worth reading. Verse 14, "Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt." So the other side of the flood means the flooding rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, basically where they came from, Abraham and Jacob. And remember how even Rachel and Leah were at least initially idolatrous because they come from an idolatrous family. He wants them to not serve those gods. Verse 15. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose ye this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's, I'm sure you've heard that verse before, but it's worth our thinking about. Are you going to serve the idols of our day, the ways of the world, the way the world thinks, the ideas and values the world would give you? Are you going to serve that, or are you going to serve the Lord? And your answer to that question, one way we could put this is, what will you let prevail most in your life? Will God prevail more than anything else in your life? Will you make more time for God and less time for the world? Those are questions that I think President Nelson would ask you. Will you keep your covenant? And that's the question that will determine whether we received all of the blessings of the covenant, including the true promised land. So that's what we learn in chapter 24. Now let's move on to the era of the judges. When Joshua dies, we do not have another figure who replaces him as the leader of all of Israel. Instead, we get a group or a bunch of different people that are called judges. So let's ask ourselves this question: what does the term judges mean? It comes from the word shofat, which we translate as judge. I would say in some ways leader is a better way, but not really. Let's look at the term like to judge. And to judge really means to make things right. We think of judge as judicial, and when we hear judge not that you be not judged, that we think that means don't decide whether someone is good or bad or something. That's not what it means. It means judgment means to make things right, to make things the way they should be. So there is a judicial element to that. If someone steals from someone else, then to make it right, we need to give it back. And if someone is oppressing someone else, to make it right, we need to get them to stop, and if they won't, then they'll have to be punished so that they will stop oppression, that kind of a thing. But that's what judgment means. So a judge is a leader whose responsibility it is to make everything right. Militarily, religiously, socially, in every way, they're supposed to make things right. Now, it will turn out that they will focus on military more than anything else. And I can understand that because they're surrounded by people who want to kill them, right? So I can understand that. And so judges will often be thought of as military leaders that we'll see not always. But a judge is one who is supposed to make things right, whether that be in a military way or in a social way, in a spiritual way, political way, whatever it is, they're supposed to make things right. And when you think about the way that phrase is used in the Book of Mormon, when they set up the reigns of the judges, that's what it is initially. Alma is, as the chief judge, is the head of the military. He's the head of politics. He's the head of judicial matters. He's the head of the church. He's the head of everything. That's what a judge is supposed to be. He will divide those roles out during his time as a judge. But that's what it means to be a judge, all right? And so you're going to get judges during the period of the judges. You're going to get judges that sometimes are judges in one tribe, sometimes judges of a couple tribes, very rarely judges of all the tribes. And some judges are more effective than others, as we'll look at, all right? But let's look at the overarching theme of the book of Judges. And to do that, we're going to look at a chart that was created by one of my teachers and mentors, Donald Perry. Well, actually, I can't remember if this is an adaptation of his chart in his article, so it's not exactly the way he did it. What we're going to see, and it's set up for us in chapter 2, and so we'll just read it. Chapter 2, verse 11 says, "The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord." And so then we get verse 14, "And he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about." We're going to see that usually there's a period of repentance, but it's not mentioned here. And then we get a deliverer raised up. The Lord raised up judges, all right? So that's kind of the general theme, and it is that we could call this the pride cycle, the idolatry cycle. I call it the covenant corruption cycle, meaning we don't keep the covenant correctly. We get the blessings of the covenant, and we think we're great, so we stop relying on God, and then God has to humble us so that we'll try and keep the covenant again. But it's this kind of cycle where they go into apostasy, they're humbled, they repent, and then God delivers them. So we'll see it, and we're not going to go through this in depth, but we'll see in chapter 3 that this is going to happen with Othniel, and it's also going to happen with Ehud, and it's also going to happen with Deborah and Barak in chapter 4 and 5. Then we get the story of Gideon in chapter 6, and you can see it's just the same story again and again and again. The book of Judges feels a lot like the book of Ether in the Book of Mormon. So in the Book of Mormon, you see the pride cycle, which again I would call the covenant corruption cycle. You see it happening again and again in the Book of Mormon, but then you get the Book of Ether where it's a long period of time condensed into a short amount of pages, and it looks like it's just that cycle and fast forward, right? That's what the Book of Judges is. Long period of time and a few pages, and so you get the same cycle in fast forward motion, right? So you get Gideon, you get Jephthah, and then you get Samson. Note that in this particular one, there's the apostasy oppression. We don't have record of them repenting, and that's probably why they get Samson. Then there are some other stories in the Book of Judges after that, but not really a judge. So just to give you an idea, don't worry about trying to read this map, but this is a map that points out stories that happen in the Book of Judges, and the reason I'm putting it up is I want you to see how it ranges throughout the entire Promised Land. There are stories happening all over the place from the Book of Judges because it's stories about tribes who are tribal. They are not united together, they are tribal. Sometimes the tribes fight each other, sometimes they'll come together in order to fight someone else, sometimes that's other tribes, sometimes that's outside enemies. They're very, very tribal, they're not united at all right? So we're going to look only at a couple of stories. There are lots of great stories and lots of sad stories in the Book of Judges. We're going to look at just a couple of stories. We're going to look, first of all, at the story of Deborah and Barak, one of the more famous stories, but it's one that is worth looking at. And we'll point out these different little things that talk about where the story happens in just a minute. I just want to point out it happens in a big valley called the Jezreel Valley. We're going to look in just a moment about why that valley is so important, and Mount Tabor in that valley, all right? So that's where things are going to happen. So we'll just read a little bit here from Judges chapter 4. The Lord sells the Israelites into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. That's actually the name of the king that's in Hatzor, so we don't know, is everyone named Jabin, or if they just got mixed up and gave him the same name as someone else, we don't know. In any case, he has a captain, a general who's just amazing, whose name is Sisera, and the children of Israel are oppressed by these guys, so they cry into him because these Jabin and Sisera have 900 chariots. That's a lot of chariots. And they're oppressed for 20 years. And then look at verse 4. And Deborah, a prophetess. So let's stop right there. If we're going to understand the Old Testament, and this is important for understanding both the first and the second half of the Old Testament, we have to understand that we use the name or the phrase prophet differently than it's been used at any other point in history. When we say the word prophet, we tend to think presiding high priest. So right now, President Russell M. Nelson, hopefully this lesson lasts long enough that as much as I'd like to see him live forever, he probably won't, and there'll be other prophets. But we think of the presiding high priest. That's what we think of when we use the word prophet. But typically, the word prophet is used, or prophetess, that's its feminine form, is used to mean someone who's inspired by God to speak something. Now, if we're going to look in this period of the Old Testament for a kind of hierarchy, the way we're used to it with First Presidency, Quorum of the 12, and so on, we're not going to find it. And we'd like to think that among all these prophets, and there are many that are prophesying at the same time, that maybe there's one that presides and so on. That may be true, but if so, we can't find the evidence for it in the Old Testament. We just can't figure out what the structure is, all right? So let's just not try and impose the way things are for us on the Old Testament. Let's just accept it as kind of hodgepodge in a way that we don't understand, and I don't know if that's because we know they're always in varying states of apostasy or what, but it's kind of messy and we don't know exactly how it works. So when we read that Deborah is a prophetess, let's recognize that it's saying she is inspired by God, and people recognize that inspiration and will follow her inspiration. So she's a prophetess, and I would guess because of that, she judges Israel at that time, meaning she's the leader in Israel. And she dwells under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel and Mount Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. And she sent and called Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh Naphtali. So this is there are lots of Kadeshes all over the place. This is the one that is we already talked about Kadesh Barnea. This is the one that's in the land of Naphtali. And she says, hath not the Lord God of Israel commanded, saying, go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with thee 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and the children of Zebulun. So we're getting two tribes together here. And I will draw unto thee to the river Kishon, Sisera, the captain of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude, and I will deliver him into thine hand. And Barak says, I'm not going if you don't go. And so she says, then I'll go with you. And so him trusting in her inspiration, Barak will go with her. He'll lead the army. She'll be the overall leader, as it were. So they come here to Mount Tabor. You can see the mount there. Note that little church right on the top, because this is the traditional Mount of Transfiguration. We don't know if it really is the mount or not. There are two best candidates. This is one of them. Here's the church on top of it that you can see here. This church here, it's right here, built to commemorate the Transfiguration. In any case, you can see Mount Tabor. It's just this big rounded hill with all sorts of flatness around it in the middle of this valley. And so that's where they're going to go. And take their armies up on top of that hill. So they'll get the highland, and that gives them an advantage. Then Deborah said unto Barak, Up, for this is the day in which the Lord hath delivered Sisera into thine hand. Is not the Lord gone out before thee? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor, and 10,000 men after him. And the Lord discomfited Sisera and all his chariots and all his hosts. So the Israelites don't have chariots, but they're running down the hill, and they're running into these chariots and the horses, and they're successful. Clearly a miracle. With the edge of the sword before Barak, so that Sisera lighted down off his chariot and fled away on his feet. So Sisera is going to run away because this is going so terribly, all right? So now we can kind of follow what's going on the map here. And we'll keep doing this. They're on Mount Tabor. You get them coming and fighting the battle here on this side, all right? And then Sisera runs away this way. Now, there's a reason that Sisera is running away. The Lord, because part of Israel's problem is that they keep thinking that the good things that happen to them happen because they're so great and powerful. And the Lord wants to remind them that it's not because they're great and powerful, but because He is with them. He will continually do things to remind them that when they win battles, it's not because of them, it's because of Him. In this case, He says to Barak and the powerful men in the army, the mighty men in the army, He says, you won't be the one to kill Sisera. Instead, I'll have a woman kill him, so that you'll know it's not because you're all big and brawny, right? And that's exactly what happens. Sisera is running along, and he sees a tent of a Kenite, and there's a woman in there, and they were supposed to have some kind of ties with them, and he wants to hide, and she says, okay, you can hide in my tent. And she even gives him some milk to help him feel better, but it's really to help him want to fall asleep. And so she says, hide under this rug, and he falls asleep under the rug. She gets a stake that she would use to put up her tent, and she gets a mallet that she would use to pound that stake into the ground, and as he's asleep under the rug, she puts the stake right there on the temple of his head and pounds him down, nails him to the ground, right? Can't help but make a dad or seminary teacher joke. This is the first stake temple work, but anyway, she nails him to the ground, and he dies that way. And now everyone knows that the great hero Sisera didn't die because Israelites were so tough, but because God delivered them as He had this non-Israelite woman kill Sisera. In any case, the battle continues to go the way for the Israelites, so they have to chase all these guys in their chariots all the way through this valley, and they chase them all the way out to the waters of Tanakh, and then over, it says Tanakh, and it also says the waters of Megiddo, so I don't know if it's to here and here, or if they're going towards Tanakh, and then they end up over at Megiddo, but somehow they get over towards Megiddo. So this is the view from Mount Carmel. Let's go back and look here. Here is Mount Carmel, all right? And this picture is taken from here looking this way, this next picture. So it's taken from here looking this way. So if you go this way, you've got Mount Tabor on the left, and you have the waters of Megiddo right here. And so the battle goes all this long way across there. They chase them all the way over to here. And they get there to, here's Megiddo, Tel Megiddo. The kings came and fought, and then fought the kings of Canaan in Taanach by the waters of Megiddo. They took no gain of money. And so this is where this battle ends, somewhere in this area there by Megiddo. All right? That's a fantastic story, and we learn that God is with them, and that they should be learning that they win battles because they trust in God, not because they trust in themselves. Now we're going to do the story of Gideon, but as we do the story of Gideon, I want to do one other thing that I think will help you understand a whole bunch of stories in the Old Testament. One of the things I want you to recognize is that there's a lot of reality going on here, right? The scriptures are real. So the geography often comes to play in these biblical stories in ways that they don't really even talk about, but that when you're familiar with the geography, you can recognize. And so as I want to show you that, I'm going to also show you a website that I think is a really, really helpful and useful website that you'll want to use all the time when you're studying the scriptures. So what we want to do go to a website that's been created that's a great website. It's called scriptures.byu.edu. So go to scriptures.byu.edu/mapscript. It doesn't have a T on the end, just mapscript. So scriptures.byu.edu/mapscript. And when you go there, you'll get this thing, and I want to point this out if we go over to the info. I want to give credit where credit is due. Taylor Halverson had the idea for this, and Stephen Little developed the website. And the geocoding and the maps and everything else are initially coming from openbible.info, and they're using a Creative Commons license so that we can use this, you can use this because of the Creative Commons license and the great work done by openbible.info. All right, so what you can do is you can go to any given chapter, and it will show you the relevant sites in that chapter. So I'll show you that in just a second. What I want to do first of all, we're going to do like really big picture first of all right? So let's do this big of a picture. You can see here is Europe, here is Asia, here is Africa. If you're going to go from Europe to Africa, look where you have to go through. If you're going to go from Asia or the Middle East, but that's really technically part of Asia, to Africa, look where you have to go through. If you're going to Africa to either of those places, you have to go through this area right here. It's often called the land bridge or even the sacred bridge, all right? That's part of why everybody wants this area. It controls the military and the trade routes between 3 continents. It's incredibly strategically important, so everyone wants that area. Now let's get in and look at how really, really crucial some particular areas are. If you're going to go, you can't go through this desert area, all right? This desert is really impassable. So if you're going to do it, you're going to end up needing to go along the Mediterranean coast. So let's just say you're coming from Egypt to go up to either Europe or Asia. If you're coming from Egypt, you're going to have to go along the coast. The problem is that if you stay along the coast, you eventually get to what is modern-day Haifa, but can you see how that mountain goes right out to the seashore? It's impassable. You can't take this route and continue on. So sooner or later, you are going to have to go from the west to the east. There are a couple of ways you could do it. There are several routes that people take as they go north-south. So there's this way of the sea that ends here. There's what's known as the way of the patriarchs. This is the way that often Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went, coming from Beersheba along. It's called also the ridge route. They'd go along the high points of this ridge, and then you can get up to here. But if you're coming from here, you're going to have to get up to that ridge, and there is a series of 5 valleys that can take you up there. They're not that easy. There's some tricks to those valleys. That's not your number one route, but they come to play. Those 5 valleys come to play. So next time we'll actually, no, not in the next lesson, 2 lessons from now, we'll talk about one of these valleys. You could go along this Jordan River here, but again, at some point, you can go all the way along that north and south. It's called the Jordan Rift route, but you still have to get from this west over to the east to get there. Or you can go along what's called the King's Highway. It's like the ridge route on this side. You have these mountains on this side. So basically, this is the same set of mountains, just the largest rift in the world, or the deepest rift in the world, is in between them. So there's a ridge route on this side that is called the King's Highway, and that's where eventually everyone has to get to, is this King's Highway, and go up this way if you're going to keep going. So sooner or later, you have to go from the west to the east. You can go along these little valleys that I talked about, but the best route, where you can take the most people through, is going to go through this Jezreel Valley. The Jezreel Valley with Mount Tabor in it that we talked about is the best way to get through. And so really there are 2 passes that will get you in coming from the west. One is the Yokneam Pass, which is actually not that easy. Today it is. It's got a nice tunnel, but in ancient times it was not very easy. The best route was through what's known as the Megiddo Pass. You remember we just talked about Megiddo, Har Tel Megiddo, where the Deborah and Barak chased all the Canaanites to. There's a little pass that goes through here, all right? And once you're in there, then you can go along the Jezreel Valley and get down to the Jordan Rift or up to the King's Highway by going out this way, the Harod Pass, it's often called, and you get this narrow neck of land here. So it's not a surprise. You've got Megiddo built over here that is a city that guards that way. So you can control, if you control that pass, you control the trade routes between 3 continents. And also Beit Sha'an, which in the Savior's Day will be renamed Scythopolis, but Beit Sha'an controls the way out, Or if you're coming from this side, it controls the way in. So if you can control either of these areas, you control the trade routes and the military routes between 3 continents. And so it will not be a surprise that often battles are fought over these areas. We can talk about Megiddo another time, but I could name 20 people who have conquered Megiddo. It's such an important place. But we're right now going to focus on this particular part here, this Ein Harod route, which has as its narrowest point right here between Mount Gilboa and Mount Moriah. So this is where the narrowest part is, and so a number of battles are going to be fought right here because this is the area that everyone wants to control. So we're going to read about the battle between the Midianites and Gideon and the Israelites, but it doesn't tell us in the Bible that this is a battle over. They're each trying, the Midianites trying to prevent the Israelites from being able to move anywhere or do anything, and the Israelites trying to have that ability. They are throttled and controlled by the Midianites because the Midianites control this pass. And it makes it so the Israelites can't do anything. And so that's what this battle will be fought over. Never says it in the text, you just figure it out from the geography. So for example, if we were to go to Judges and go to chapter 6, which is where we get the story of Gideon, then it automatically drops these little points in the places that are particular for this, or that are mentioned in that chapter, all right? Sometimes we don't know exactly where they are, and it's a little speculative. But in this case, we're going to focus on, this is where Gideon's from. Well, he's from down south, but then he has a place here, and the battle that takes place right here in this narrow neck of land. So I think actually the thing should be right here where these waters are. But in any case, that's a useful tool for you, and I hope you find that helpful. And I think we should be able to better understand the story as we do this. So I hope that going through that exercise and looking at the geography and the topography and the map and showing you that cool tool, I hope that that will help us make more sense of this particular story. I think we're fairly familiar with the story. I just want to highlight a few elements of it. This is the story of deliverance from the Midianites. The Midianites that it describes as being like grasshoppers for number, and they control the Israelites, I think, by controlling the trade routes. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the Lord's plan for delivering from the Midianites? We're not going to answer this question right now. We're going to answer it as we go along, all right? But let's ask this question. How does Gideon begin? And I think this is worth thinking about. When Gideon is called, he's an unlikely hero. He's not so sure he's the guy for the job. He's not from the most prominent family. He's not the most prominent person, but God calls Gideon. And the first thing he does is tear down altars to Baal. Before he goes out and does what God asks him to do, he starts to clean up things at home. There's a lesson in there as well. He's getting rid of the bad things in his and his people's lives so that then they can go do the good things. But that first step is to try and get rid of some of these bad things. And we should think about, as we go through this story, how Gideon might represent us as we try to move throughout life and as we try to do what God asks us to do, especially when God asks us to do something that's beyond our ability to do, which he often will, and which we don't feel like we're necessarily the right person for the job. We should be able to identify with Gideon in this story as we do this. Let's also ask the question, how does God work with Gideon's doubts? All right, so we know the story of Gideon asking for a sign. And as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that often kind of rattles us. We think, wait, a sign? We shouldn't ask for a sign. And I think we've talked about this before, but the notion is we don't want to ask for signs by saying, I'm not going to believe until you show me a sign. But once we are already believing and acting, God seems pretty patient if we say, are you still with me? Is this how you want me to do it? Am I doing it the right way? In those questions, God seems to be willing to work with us for signs. So you're familiar with the story where Gideon has already done a lot and he's ready to keep moving forward, but he's now at the point where it's time to start to fight the Midianites, and he wants to know that God is still with him, that he's still doing things the way God wants him to, and so he says, okay, I'm going to put a fleece out in front of my tent, and when I wake up in the morning, let's have the fleece. I can't remember which is first, but let me look at that. Okay, let's read how God works with Gideon when he has these doubts and he wants to know that God is still with him. So we're in Judges chapter 6, verse 36. And Gideon said unto God, if thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said, Behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said. And it was so, for he rose up early on the morrow and thrust the fleece together and wringed the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. So there's lots of water in it. But I think Gideon then says, no, wait a minute. Actually, wool's pretty good at maintaining water. Maybe it's that way every morning. Maybe I didn't ask for a very good sign. So, verse 39, and Gideon said unto God, let not thine anger be hot against me, and I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry only upon the fleece, and upon all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, for it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground. So now Gideon knows God really is with him. He is going to deliver him, that he's still going according to God's plan. I think there's a tremendous principle behind Gideon and his willingness to act even when he's nervous, doesn't think he's the right guy, his willingness to seek reassurance from the Lord, but keep moving forward throughout all of that. I mean, he does this as he's moving forward, right? I think that this idea is summed up so well by Elder Maxwell, who has this gift for summing things up well, right? This is what Elder Maxwell says. God does not begin by asking us about our ability, but only about our availability. And if we then prove our dependability, he will increase our capability. So the next time you find yourself like Gideon, and you've been asked to do something that seems beyond your ability, remember this from Elder Maxwell. It doesn't matter what your ability is, only your availability. And then when you prove your dependability, he'll increase your capability, right? God will make you equal to the task. Another way, President Monson says it this way, for whom God calls, he qualifies. Right? He will make you equal to the task. You just have to do what he asks, even if it means marching around a wall 7 times or whatever else. You have to do it the way he asks. This is how President Hinckley said, in essence, the same thing. Do what you can do in the best way you know, and the Lord will accept of your effort. That's all he's asking. Do what you can do in the best way you know, and the Lord will accept of your effort. Now, interestingly, God tells Gideon, you have gathered too big of an army. I don't want you to go against the Israelites with that big of an army. So we have to ask ourselves, why would God reduce the army? And I think the answer is pretty clear, and God gives us that answer. He says, then Jerubbaal, so this is another name for Gideon when he tears down the altars of Baal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that, and it's really a spring, and we'll look at it in a second, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give to the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. So just like with Deborah and Barak, God wants them to know it's not because they're so big and bad, and it's not because of their ability, it's him that does the delivering. So let's read what God says to them. We're in chapter 7, Judges chapter 7, verse 3. Now therefore go to, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. So there were 32,000 originally, and he says, if you're a little bit nervous about this, go home. And 2/3 went home, and 10,000 remain. But that's still too many. God is worried that they will still vaunt themselves. So I want you to be able to kind of picture what's happening here, all right? We've got, here is this way into the valley, right? And the narrow area between Mount Moreh and Mount Gilboa, right there. Here's a picture from Mount Gilboa where the spring is that we're going to talk about. Across the way, you can see Mount Moreh. So the Midianite army is right here. Gideon's army is right here. And they've got this lake wasn't there at the time, but they've got just this valley in between them. Here is actually Ein Harod. It comes out right here. We'll zoom in. Can you see where the water bubbles right there? That's where the spring actually comes out. And so what Gideon does is he says, all right, he gets these 10,000 people and he brings them up to where they can drink out of there. And those who lay down on their stomach and drink without watching, and maybe this is the way to tell if they're looking for enemies or not, but those who lay down and drink without that, they're sent home, and it's only those who get down and use their hand. You can see my daughters there doing this at Harod, use their hand to bring the water up. They're the ones who are going to stay. And now you get down to about 300 people. And they're up against a very large group, for they came up with their cattle, this is the Midianites, and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude, for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. So huge army against a very small army, right? Very, very small army. So again, this is to help you picture it. This is taken from the other side. This is from the western side. Here's Mount Moreh. There's Mount Gilboa. The battle is going to take place in this area in between, with Gideon's army here, the Midianite army right here, and the battle takes place in between. But it actually doesn't, because it takes place that's where they thought the battle would take place, but it takes place where the Midianite army is. Because what happens, and this is because the Lord tells Gideon to do it this way, Gideon, and he's given another sign as he overhears dreams of the Midianites and so on, but he gets his 300 men, and each one is given an oil lamp and a pot. And then they go, and the 300 men surround the Midianites. All right, now, here's what you have to recognize, that typically if you're having an army go in the night for a night raid, you're not going to have every man with a lamp. You're going to have just a couple with a lamp. All right, but everyone has a lamp. And so on a signal, they all uncover or light their lamps, and they take their pots and they throw them down to break them, so making a lot of noise, and they yell, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The Midianites wake up and they see all these lights and they hear all this noise, and they assume they are surrounded by a huge army, but it's only 300 guys. But they assume they're surrounded by a huge army. So they get up to fight this army, but the only people they're going to encounter are each other. So they end up killing each other, confused, thinking that these must be my enemies, but they're not their enemies. Now, it doesn't say that exactly, but I'm reading into it. I think this is what happened. But what we do know is that they light the lights, throw the lamps down, say, "The sword of the Lord and Gideon," and then the Midianites get confused and they kill each other. We know that happens. All right, so that is how they know that God is the one who really does this. Now, again, I want to kind of highlight something here. We've got Mount Moreh on one side. You've seen this already with the Midianite army and Mount Gilboa and Gideon's army. If we fast forward, and we'll do this in a couple of lessons, but if we just fast forward to the days of Saul, you've still got Mount Moreh and Mount Gilboa, but it's Saul's army and the Philistine army. You've got a different group fighting in the same place. Why? Because this place controls the routes between three continents. When Saul is killed right there at Beit Shean up here, his body will be put there. In any case, back to the story of Gideon. When they defeat the Midianites run all the way down this way, and Gideon will chase them and destroy them and give Israel liberation from the Midianites. But the question is really, who won the battle? And I think the answer is pretty clear, that it's God. There's no way 300 men can defeat that huge army, but they did because God was with them. Again, God wants to make sure that they know it's Him, because that way they don't get into that pride cycle or covenant corruption cycle. They keep relying on God. That's what we have to master in our own lives, to stop thinking that good things are happening because of us, but instead to rely on God. Let's turn to one last story. Really the last judge, and this is a story that, of course, is kind of a sad story. This is the story of Samson. We're going to try and make it come to life for you a little bit and also learn a couple of things. All right, and then we have a couple other stories, but they're not stories of judges. The story of Samson takes place in the Sorek Valley. This is when Dan still had their territory down there, and you've got the Sorek River going through here, and you have the territory of Dan, and you have the Philistines over on this side. Next time, or the time after that, in a couple of lessons, we're going to talk about the Philistines more. But for now, let's just understand that this is where this story takes place. This is from Beit Shemesh, where they're doing excavations, but looking out at this valley where all of this takes place. So just so you can kind of picture, tells you all sorts of places, and we'll look at this map again, where all sorts of events in the story of Samson, just so you can get an idea that the story all takes place in a pretty small area. All right. This is taken from way up in the hills looking down on that valley, and we're going to read just a little bit from Judges chapter 13. The woman bare a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So that's where Sora is, and that's where Eshtaol is. So the story is going to take place, or this is where he grows up. Samson grows up in this little area between these two places, okay? Here are pictures of the forest of Eshtaol, so you can just kind of picture it's actually a pretty cool place that he's growing up in, all right? Now, we all know the story that, that Samson is going to fall in love with a Philistine woman, and his parents are going to help him get her for wife. So here we have it in Judges 14. And Samson went down to Timnah. So here you can see where Timnah is. So here's Eshtaol and Sora. He's from right there. Timnah is just down the road. All right. And he goes down to Timnath or Timnah, and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he falls in love with this Philistine woman. So just so you know, again, we're looking from Beit Shemesh. So if just straight to your right is where Samson lives, and Timnah's just on the other side of that ridge, right? This is an hour's walk, or maybe a little more, but not. It's more than an hour, but not that far, right? And so that's where the story is taking place. And then went Samson down and his father and his mother to Timnah, and he came to the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion roared against him. All right, so there were lions that lived in this area at this time, and this was an area where the lions, we're used to thinking of lions on the plains of the Serengeti, and that's where speed makes all the difference. So the lionesses do the hunting because they have to chase these animals down, and they're faster because the lions are so big and strong, but they're not as fast. But in this area, it's more about being sneaky and then jumping out and killing quickly. So the lions do the hunting in areas like this, where they jump out from these trees, and this is that Sorek brook or river. The lions jump out and do the killing, all right? And we know the story that he kills the lion, and then he sees that there's a honey or beehive gets kind of made in the carcass of the lion, and he comes down and he gives a riddle. He makes a bet to the Philistines. They're in Timnah when he's getting married, and then they trick the answer to the riddle out of his new wife. And so Samson has to give them 30 pieces of clothing and so on. And this is where we'll read in verse 19 that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and slew 30 men of them and took their spoil and gave changes of garments unto them, which expounded the riddle. All right? So he's going now to another Philistine city to kill the people there, to give the garments to other Philistines. He's a kind of crazy guy. So that's going to Ashkelon. So you can see this is where he grows up, and Timnah. So if he's going to kill a bunch of people, it's not going to be the people that live by him, so he has that problem. So he goes all the way over here to Ashkelon, right on the seashore. This is Philistine Ashkelon, the walls of Philistine Ashkelon, right on the Mediterranean Sea there, all right? And we're not going to go through all of the problems that that Samson has or all of the different story. You're probably fairly familiar with it. If not, I'd plead with you to read all of this one way or the other and get familiar with it. But one of the more famous ones is when he's upset because his wife been getting to someone else and so on. And so we'll read this. Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn or the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain with the vineyards of olives. So that happens, Timnah's right here, right? So it's the story with the foxes takes place right where we're looking, where those fields are, all right? Another time, he's going to kill people with the jawbone of an ass. That's up in here. He's going to go down to Gaza and have what we'll read right here. It came to pass that afterwards he loved a woman. He has problems with the people in Gaza. And then he falls in love with Delilah in the valley of Sorek, which is the valley that he's from, right? So probably somewhere around where Timnah is. It's somewhere in this valley that he meets Delilah. And then we know that the story where Delilah keeps trying to trick him, and I don't know why he can't learn that she can't be trusted, but eventually he does confide in her that his strength comes because he's a Nazirite, and part of being a Nazirite is that you don't cut your hair. And so she tells the Philistines, and they cut his hair, and he is captured and taken to Gaza. Let's read the ending of this story and then see what lessons we can learn from this. And then we'll try and just wrap up with some of the more crazy stories in the book of Judges. So when we go to the story of Samson, and it ends in chapter 16, after he has been made a slave and served the Philistines in Gaza for quite a while. We get to finally let's go to chapter 16, and we're going to read about verse 25. And it came to pass when their hearts were merry that they said, Call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars in this great big place where they're all sitting, and it's got pillars holding up the ceiling. And Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, Suffer me that I may fill the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them, because they've put his eyes out, he's blind. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld while Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was borne up, of the one with the right hand and of the other with his left. And Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. I think there are some lessons we should try and learn from this story. I don't want to be too hard on Samson, but I think that he was not the best judge that they ever had. He was the judge that had the most potential. If you're going to talk about natural gifts and natural abilities to deliver them militarily, Samson's the guy. He can kill lots of people. He can lead armies because he's so fearful in battle and so on. He had a tremendous amount of potential because he had a gift from God. But I want us to think about the different times that Samson used that gift, the times that it tells us that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him and that gift came upon him. So the first one is to kill a lion. Self-preservation, not a terrible motive, but it's about himself. So it's to kill a lion. The next time we read about it is when he's lost a bet, so he goes and kills a bunch of people to get clothes so he can pay off the bet. The next time we read about it is when he's upset because his wife has been given away. The next time we read about it is when they've caught him and he uses his great strength to save himself. And the last time we read about it is when he wants to avenge himself of his eyes. The common thread is self. Every time we read that Samson used his gift, and there may have been other times, but at least the times we read that Samson used his gift, it was not to deliver Israel. It was not to help other people. It was for himself. And as a result, in many ways, Samson was a miserable failure as a judge, though he had the greatest potential. That's an important lesson to learn. God has given you a gift. In fact, section 46 tells us that we all have a gift from God. God has given each one of us a gift, and the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you use your gift? Are you using it for yourself, or are you using it to build up the kingdom of God? And if we learn anything from Samson, we learn that he did not use his gift the right way. He used it for himself, and we need to use our gifts for God and for others. That's an incredible lesson. Now let's tell one last story that I tell both because it is the low point of Israelite culture, I believe, at least at this time period. It represents the low point of Israelite culture, and that will help us understand in the next lesson when we get to Samuel how important it is to follow Samuel out of that low point, but also because there are some details in this story that will come to play in future stories that we need to be familiar with. So I'm going to use a map that I made that for a different story, has all sorts of little bubbles in it that tell a different story, so I've actually just grayed those out, and we're going to tell this story. The story goes that there's a man from up north who has a concubine from down south, south of Jerusalem. And the concubine gets tired of him or being there with him or something, and she runs back home to where she's from. And he apparently loves her, and so he wants to go get her. So he travels down to get her, and he comes to her father's house, and he stays several days with her. The father's so happy to have her back home. He keeps convincing this man, stay another day, stay another day, stay another day. And he stays for a long time and finally says, it's time for us to go home. And so the day they're going to get home, the father convinces him, stay at least a little while longer, and so they get a much later start than they intended. And as a result, when it's time to start to find a place to stay or a place to sleep the night, they're getting close to Jerusalem. But at this point, Jerusalem is controlled Here's Jerusalem. It's controlled by the Jebusites, by Canaanites, and he doesn't feel like he can stay there safely. So he pushes on until it's late to get to a place just north of Jerusalem called Gibeah. All right. Now, in another generation, this is where Saul is from. At this point, probably Saul's father is a young man or a middle-aged man, something along those lines. So he's going to go to Gibeah. This is Gibeah today, the remains of a palace that was being built there that never was finished. But in any case, this is where he stayed the night with a man from Gibeah. All right, and the Israelites in Gibeah. So this is in the territory of Benjamin. The Benjaminites in Gibeah are not a very righteous group, and they come up and they want to rape this man. They want to rape his concubine and so on. They are able to get his concubine, and they gang rape her to death. Again, this is not a high point in Israelite history. This is a low point. They are not doing well, and that's what we need to understand, that they are not, I think they haven't been renewing the covenant, and they are not doing well. They gang rape her to death. When this man comes the next morning and finds that his wife has died, he's very upset about it, and so he sends a rather gory message. There must be something about the way we're going to see later Saul do the same thing with cattle, where he'll cut cattle up into 12 pieces and sends a piece of it to all of Israel. But this man cuts his dead wife into 12 pieces and sends one to each of the tribes of Israel, saying, "Come and help me bring justice to these people," meaning that there should be punishment for the people that have gone and raped my wife to death. And so people come from all the tribes, and they show up there. And they say to the tribe of Benjamin, "Hand over the perpetrators." And this is typical tribal kind of politics. The Benjaminites say, "We're not giving anyone from our tribe to any of you." And so there's a battle that's fought, and it's fought a couple of times. And eventually, Benjamin is almost completely wiped out. Hardly any Benjaminites left. And after this is all done, the rest of the tribes say, "Okay, well, we did what we said we needed to do, but now we have a problem. We don't want to have a tribe completely disappear. So we need to have some wives for these few men that have survived of Benjamin to be able to marry so they can have children so the tribe doesn't die out." But the problem is that they had all sworn, when they'd lost the battle a couple of times and they really were upset, they'd all sworn never would anyone from Benjamin marry anyone from any of their families. And they said, this is a problem because they need to marry someone or the tribe dies out. And they said, was there anyone that didn't come to battle? Because anyone who didn't come to battle didn't make the oath. And they recognized that some men from Jabesh Gilead, so that's across the Jordan River and over on the other side up in the mountains, the men of Jabesh Gilead had not made that oath. And this you'll recognize some Book of Mormon-ish stories in here. The people from the Book of Mormon probably were familiar with this story and acted on it, but in any case they say, okay, why don't you guys from Benjamin who don't have wives, you can go up to Jabesh Gilead, and if you kidnap some women from there, they can be your wives, and the tribe won't die out. And that's exactly what they do. And that's really how the book of Judges ends. It's not a happy note to end on. It is, in fact, a very, very sad note to end on. We need to know this story because it's going to come to play in a couple of other stories in the future, but also because I want us to see that with the lack of relying on God, the lack of covenant renewal, the focus, in fact, the book of Judges ends with this very sad note. Chapter 21, verse 25. And as we read this, I want you to think about some of the lessons we can learn from the book of Judges, but maybe this is the biggest one. In some ways, they're setting them up for having a king, and I don't think that's really what God wanted, so let's ignore that part about the king, but it's the second part that's really important. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. They were self-centered. They didn't let God determine what was right. They did what was right for them. It's kind of a you do you, you only live once kind of a society, right? Not about God, not about taking care of each other, just doing what seems right to you, regardless of the effect it has on other people. And that doesn't work for them. They descend to pretty low depths as a result of that. But the other lesson we can learn is that when they do trust in God, God always accepts them back, and he always delivers them. And so the key is to forget about ourselves and trust in God.